My name is Harvey Fields. For 3 years, I worked the overnight shift at a small gas station hidden along Highway 41 just outside Black Creek, Kentucky. During the day, if you drove past that place, you probably wouldn't even slow down. It looked like every other forgotten roadside station scattered across rural America. 6 aging fuel pumps stood beneath a weathered canopy. A tiny convenience store sat behind them, its faded red sign still proudly advertising fountain drinks for 99 cents, a price that hadn't been true in years. Inside, there was a coffee machine humming beside the drink coolers, a few narrow aisles packed with snacks and supplies, and a single employee standing behind the counter. Nothing about it seemed unusual, and that was exactly why I took the job. I wasn't looking for excitement. I wasn't chasing some impossible dream or trying to reinvent my life. After nearly 10 years of bouncing from one job to another, I was tired of uncertainty. I wanted something simple, something predictable. A place where I could clock in, do my work, collect my paycheck, and go home. There was something comforting about routine. Same building, same hours, same quiet nights. At least that was what I believed when I accepted the position. The gas station sat nearly 30 miles from the nearest town. Whoever built it had chosen one of the most isolated stretches of highway imaginable. There were no houses nearby, no restaurants, no glowing fast food signs in the distance, no truck stops filled with travelers. Just that lonely little station surrounded by endless wilderness. Behind the building were a dumpster area, a locked propane cage, and a thick wall of hardwood trees stretching deep into the darkness. Across the highway, the forest continued even farther. Once midnight passed and the store lights reflected less against the windows, the outside world seemed to disappear completely. If you stepped outside and turned around, you couldn't even see where the trees ended. At first I liked it. Maybe that sounds strange, but after years of dealing with crowded workplaces, noisy traffic, and people constantly demanding something from me, the silence felt peaceful. The overnight shift was usually calm, almost too calm. Within a few weeks, I knew the patterns of the regular customers. I knew who stopped by before work, who bought coffee after a late shift, and who came through just before sunrise. Some nights I would see fewer than a dozen people between midnight and morning. The hours moved slowly, but there was a strange comfort in knowing exactly what each night would bring. The owner of the station was a woman named Denise Crawford. She had owned the place for longer than anyone could remember. Some customers claimed it had been hers for 20 years. Others swore it had been closer to 35. One elderly man once told me Denise had been standing behind that same register since the 1970s. She never confirmed it. Denise was not rude. She simply wasn't someone who talked unless there was a reason. When I interviewed for the job, she looked over my application for less than 5 minutes. Then she asked me 2 questions. You okay working alone? Yes. You okay working holidays? I don't mind. She nodded. When can you start? That was it. No long interview. No corporate speeches. No personality tests. No giant employee handbook filled with meaningless rules. Just a handshake and a starting date. My first 2 weeks were exactly what I wanted. Nothing strange happened. I learned small details about the station, the kind of things only someone working alone overnight would notice. The cooler door on the left would stick if you pulled it open too hard. The lottery machine would jam whenever someone tried feeding it a wrinkled bill. Pump number 3 had a habit of shutting off after a few gallons if customers squeezed the handle too tightly. The coffee machine made a sharp clicking sound every time it finished brewing, almost like someone tapping a fingernail against the glass. Tiny things. Ordinary things. The kind of details that become familiar when you spend enough lonely nights in the same building. I settled into the job faster than any position I had ever held. Honestly, I thought I would stay there for years. Then Denise asked me to come into the office before my first night working completely alone. I remember the moment clearly. She walked past the cigarette shelves, stepped behind the counter, and entered the small office hidden behind the register. The room was barely big enough for a desk and a filing cabinet. The air smelled like old paper and dust. She unlocked the bottom drawer of a rusted metal cabinet. I expected to see payroll documents, tax paperwork, something normal. Instead, she pulled out a single, laminated sheet of paper. She placed it on the desk between us. There were 5 rules written on it. At first, I almost laughed. I thought it was some kind of joke, a weird initiation prank. I read the first rule and smiled. Then, I looked at Denise. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't laughing. She simply stood there watching me continue reading. The longer I looked at the page, the less funny it became. When I finished, I slowly lifted my eyes. Denise pushed the paper toward me. Fold it, she said quietly. Keep it in your pocket. I gave a small, nervous laugh. She didn't react. That was the moment I realized she wasn't playing around. The first rule was simple, but impossible to understand. Rule 1. If the lights go out, hide under the register until they come back on. For the rest of my first solo shift, I kept trying to convince myself Denise had just been messing with me, because honestly, it sounded ridiculous. Who hides under a cash register because the power goes out? That sounded like something you would tell a child before sending them to summer camp, not something you tell an adult working alone at a gas station. But every now and then my hand would touch the laminated paper in my pocket, and every time I felt it I remembered Denise's expression. Not fear, not concern, something worse. Certainty. The night started normally. A family traveling south stopped for fuel and snacks. 2 teenagers bought chips and energy drinks. Around 11, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee. Deputy Brett Snyder, a local officer who stopped by almost every night, walked in for his usual black coffee. As he waited, his eyes dropped to the folded paper sticking out of my shirt pocket. "She gave it to you?" I nodded. "Yeah." He stared at me for a second. Then he simply said, "Good," that was all. No explanation. No yoke. No warning. Before I could ask what he meant, he walked outside and returned to his cruiser. That bothered me more than anything, Denise had said. Because if it was a joke, he would have laughed. If it was nonsense, he would have told me. Instead, he acted like those rules were something everyone in town already understood. By 10 inches the morning, the station was completely empty. I hadn't seen a customer in nearly 40 minutes. I swept the floor, restocked the coolers, and counted cigarette cartons behind the register. Outside Highway 41 was completely dead. No headlights, no passing cars, no sound except the faint hum of the refrigerators. The silence felt almost peaceful, until it happened. The lights went out, not flickered, not dimmed. They died. Every light inside the station disappeared at once. The ceiling lights, the drink coolers, the register screen, the pumps outside, everything. The entire building was swallowed by darkness. I stood there for a moment staring into the black. Then I sighed. Seriously, my first thought was simple. Check the breaker. Fix the problem. Get back to work. I reached beneath the counter for the flashlight. Then, my fingers touched the laminated paper in my pocket. Rule 1. If the lights go out, hide under the register until they come back on. I froze. For a few seconds, I just stood there arguing with myself. Power outages happen. Generators fail. Breakers trip. That's normal. You don't crawl under a counter because the electricity goes out. I took one step toward the office. Just one. I was going to check the breaker. Then the bell above the front door rang. I stopped. Slowly, I turned around. The door was closed. I know it was closed. I had been looking directly at it. Nobody had entered. But the bell rang again. A second time. Clear. Loud. Impossible. Then I heard something else. Footsteps. Coming from the front of the store. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Not the quick footsteps of a customer. Not someone walking casually. These footsteps sounded like someone who knew exactly where they were going. I stopped breathing. Every instinct in my body told me something was wrong. Something was inside that building with me. And suddenly Denise's strange rule didn't seem ridiculous anymore. I didn't wait to find an explanation. I dropped to the floor and crawled beneath the register. I pulled my knees against my chest and held my breath. Above me, the darkness remained silent. Then the footsteps stopped, right in front of the counter, just inches away, and whatever was standing there was waiting. The space beneath the counter was never meant for a person. It was cramped, dark, and suffocating. Boxes of cigarettes pressed against my back, rolls of receipt paper dug into my shoulder. A small metal safe took up the little space where my legs should have been. The only way I could fit was by curling myself into a tight ball, pulling my knees against my chest, and trying not to make a single sound. Above me, the footsteps continued. Slow, heavy. Passant! Then I heard another set, and another. Within less than a minute, the empty gas station no longer sounded empty. It sounded crowded. Cooler doors opened and closed. Candy wrappers crackled. Something knocked against the chip display. A bottle rolled across the floor. The strange thing was not that someone was inside the store. The strange thing was that nobody spoke. Not one word. Not a single sound of a human voice. Every customer who had ever walked into that station had said something. Pump 4. Can I get a pack of cigarettes? Where's the bathroom? Do you sell lottery tickets? People always announced themselves. Even strangers made noise. But whatever was walking around my store was completely silent. I pressed my face closer to the narrow opening beneath the counter and looked out. At first, I only saw shadows moving across the floor. Then the first pair of feet stepped into view. My blood turned cold. The skin was gray. Not pale, not dirty. Gray, like something that had spent years buried underground. There were only 4 toes. Each one was unnaturally long, ending in black nails that dragged softly against the tile. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Another set of feet passed by. For a second I thought it looked almost human. Then I saw the way its legs moved. Its feet were twisted backward. The joints bent in a way no human body should ever bend. I felt my stomach tighten. I wanted to close my eyes. I wanted to believe I was hallucinating, but I couldn't, because something else had stopped directly in front of the register, right where I was hiding. It stood completely still. No movement, no breathing, no sound. Then slowly, very slowly, it lowered itself. It crouched. I watched as a hand appeared beneath the counter. A gray hand. The fingers were too long, far too long. They stretched across the floor like thin branches searching through leaves. The fingertips brushed against receipt boxes, moved past cleaning supplies, tapped lightly against the tile. Closer, closer, until they were less than a foot away from my face. I stopped breathing. My entire body locked up. The hand remained there, motionless. And then it tapped the floor. Once a pause, then again, twice. Like a person knocking on a door, except it wasn't knocking on a door. It was letting me know it knew exactly where I was. Every instinct inside me screamed to run, but there was nowhere to run. I was trapped. I was certain those fingers were about to wrap around my ankle. I was certain that was the moment it would pull me out. Then suddenly, the bell above the front door rang. The hand disappeared instantly. The creature rose, and without making a sound, it walked away. I remained frozen beneath the counter. Minutes passed. Maybe longer. I couldn't tell. More footsteps moved through the store. Cooler doors opened. Something fell from a shelf. A glass bottle rolled across the floor. Then silence returned. The kind of silence that feels heavier than noise. A second later, the lights came back on. The refrigerator started humming. The register beeped as it restarted. Everything returned to normal, but I didn't move. Not immediately. I stayed there waiting, listening, trying to convince myself that whatever had entered the station was gone. After another full minute, I slowly crawled out. The store looked exactly the same. No broken windows, no stolen items, no damaged shelves. The chip display was perfectly straight. The counter was untouched. For one brief, foolish moment, I wondered if my mind had created everything. Maybe exhaustion had finally caught up with me. Maybe the isolation was affecting me. Maybe I had imagined it all. Then I looked down, and every excuse disappeared. 3 wet footprints crossed the tile directly in front of the register. Gray footprints. 4 tooed, each one ending with deep claw marks pressed into the floor. They continued halfway down the aisle, and then stopped. No turning, no fading, no trail leading away. They simply ended, like whatever had left them had vanished into thin air. I didn't touch them. I didn't move. I stayed behind that counter until sunrise, staring at those prints and waiting for an explanation that never came. A little after 6 in the morning, Denise arrived carrying her usual cup of coffee. She stepped inside. She saw the footprints. Before she looked at me, her expression didn't change. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look afraid. She just stared at the floor. Then she finally spoke. The lights went out. It wasn't a question. I slowly nodded. Yeah, and you stayed under the register? Another nod. Yeah, for the first time since I had met her. Denise smiled. Not a big smile. Just a small expression of relief. Good. Then she walked to the closet, grabbed the mop, and cleaned the footprints herself. No hesitation. No explanation. Like she had done it before. When she finished, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I needed answers. What were those things? Denise poured the dirty mop water into the utility sink. She rinsed the bucket slowly. Then she stopped. For several seconds, she stared into the water. Finally, she looked back at me. Her voice was quiet. Don't ask. That was all she said. And somehow that answer frightened me more than anything I had seen that night, because it meant Denise knew. She had always known. The second rule was simple. Never sell gasoline to anyone wearing a raincoat when it isn't raining. After the blackout, I stopped laughing at the rules. I still didn't understand them. I still struggled to accept what I had witnessed beneath that counter. But I understood one thing. Those rules existed for a reason. For the next week, everything returned to normal. At least as normal as anything could be at that station. I worked my shifts. I stocked shelves. I cleaned coffee pots. I sold fuel to passing travelers. Denise never mentioned the footprints again, and eventually I stopped asking questions she clearly had no intention of answering. Then came Thursday night, the night I finally understood why the second rule existed. It was shortly after 0 inches the morning. The weather was perfect. The sky was completely clear. Not a single cloud. No wind. No storm. The stars were visible above the tree line shining over the empty highway. The parking lot was so still it almost felt frozen. Then headlights appeared. A vehicle slowly turned into the station. An old green pickup truck rolled toward pump number 4. The truck looked ancient, at least 40 years old. Rust covered the doors. One headlight was cracked. The tailgate looked like it was barely attached, held together by a piece of wire. The engine shut off. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was wearing a bright yellow raincoat, not a thin emergency poncho, not a jacket. A heavy rubber raincoat that reached almost to his knees. The hood covered most of his face. I immediately looked outside. The pavement was dry. The sky was clear. There was no rain, not even a drop. My hand moved before I even realized what I was doing. I reached into my pocket. I unfolded the laminated rule sheet. Rule 2. Never sell gasoline to anyone wearing a raincoat when it isn't raining. The bell above the door rang. The man walked inside, and then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Water was dripping from his coat. Not a few drops. Enough to leave a trail across the floor. He stopped in front of the counter. His voice was low and emotionless. Pump 4. I glanced toward the window. His truck was the only vehicle in the parking lot. "I'm sorry," I said. "The pumps are down." He didn't respond. He just stood there, waiting. After several seconds, he slowly tilted his head. "They were working yesterday." My mouth went dry. "I know. They're just broken tonight." Silence. A long, uncomfortable silence. Then he spoke again. "I don't need much. I'm sorry. Half a tank." I felt my hand tighten around the rule sheet. "I can't." The man stared at me. Not angrily, not impatiently, just staring. Then I noticed something. The water dripping from his raincoat wasn't clear. It was black. Every drop that touched the white tile left behind a dark stain, like oil, like mud, like something that had come from somewhere far beneath the ground. Finally, the man smiled, just slightly, only enough for me to see his teeth. They were too long, too sharp, not human. "I understand." He turned around, slowly, and walked back toward the door. The bell rang. The door opened, and the man stepped outside. I watched him through the window, waiting to see him get into the truck, waiting to see the headlights turn on, but he didn't. He simply stood beside pump 4, in the middle of a dry, empty night, wearing a raincoat that was still dripping black water onto the pavement. I realized I had been holding my breath the entire time. The man in the yellow raincoat had stepped outside, but he didn't leave. He didn't get back into his truck. He didn't start the engine. He didn't even look toward the driver's seat. He simply walked to pump number 4 and stopped, facing the store, facing me, completely motionless. At first, I thought maybe he was waiting for something. Maybe he was trying to scare me. Maybe he was just another strange person passing through the highway at night. But then 5 minutes passed, then 10, and he still hadn't moved. Not once. He didn't shift his feet. He didn't adjust his coat. He didn't scratch his face. He didn't look at the road. He didn't even seem to breathe. He just stood there like a statue beneath the yellow lights of the gas station canopy. That was when I stopped trying to understand him. I grabbed my phone and called Denise. She answered on the second ring. "Hello." Her voice was calm, almost like she already knew why I was calling. "Yeah," I whispered. "The guy from Rule 2 is here." A pause. Then raincoat. Yellow. Another pause. "Did you sell him gas?" "No," I swallowed. "No, I didn't." "Good, he's just standing there." "I know." The way she said it made my stomach tighten. "You know." "Yes." "Well, what am I supposed to do?" "Nothing." I looked back through the window. The man hadn't moved. "Denise, he's been standing there for 10 minutes." "I know." Another silence. Then I asked the question I already knew I probably didn't want answered. "When is he leaving?" For several seconds there was nothing but static on the line. Then Denise finally spoke. "When he feels like it." The call ended. I stared at my phone. That was it. No explanation. No warning. No advice. Just another impossible answer from someone who seemed to know far more than she was willing to tell me. "Not exactly helpful," I muttered. The next 20 minutes felt like hours. I tried sitting in the office. I turned on the small security monitor mounted beside the desk. Normally I used it to pass time during slow shifts. That night I couldn't focus on anything. The camera showed the empty parking lot, the dark highway, the silent pumps, and there he was, still standing beside pump 4, exactly where he had been. It was like time wasn't affecting him, like the world could continue moving around him, but he was trapped in the same moment. Every few minutes I looked through the front window. Every time, he was still there. Then around 2:0 the morning headlights appeared. Another car entered the station. A young woman pulled into the parking lot and stepped out. She looked tired, probably just another driver passing through the highway late at night. She walked toward the pumps. She didn't notice him at first, not until she was almost beside him. Then the man in the raincoat slowly turned his head. Not his body, just his head. The woman stopped instantly. Even from inside the store I could see the confusion on her face. She looked at him. Then she looked toward me through the window. For a moment it seemed like she wanted to ask what was happening, but she didn't. She slowly backed away, walked straight back to her car, got inside, and drove away. She didn't buy gas. She didn't stop to question it. She simply left. The man turned back toward the store, watching me again. Another 30 minutes passed. At that point I started wondering if he planned to stay there until sunrise. Maybe that was the purpose. Maybe he wasn't waiting for gas. Maybe he was waiting for something else. Then I saw movement behind him, at the edge of the woods. At first my mind tried to explain it. A deer, a large animal, anything normal, anything that made sense. But then the figure stepped forward, and every reasonable thought disappeared. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't any animal I'd ever seen. Whatever came out of those trees was enormous, at least 9 feet tall, maybe taller. The creature had to lower itself beneath the branches as it moved from the forest. Its arms hung almost to its knees. Its shape was broad and unnatural. The darkness hid most of its features, but I could still tell one thing. It was not human. The man in the raincoat never turned around. He never reacted, like he had been expecting it. The creature crossed the grass silently. No footsteps. No sound. It stopped directly behind him. For several seconds they stood there together. Two impossible things beneath the lights of that lonely gas station. Then the larger figure slowly reached out and placed one hand on the man's shoulder. Not aggressively, not like an attack. Almost gently, like an old friend greeting someone they had known for years. The man in the raincoat finally moved. Together they walked toward the woods, slowly disappearing between the trees. Neither one looked back at the station. Not once. By sunrise I ran outside. I needed proof. Anything. Something that would tell me I wasn't losing my mind. But the parking lot was completely empty. No footprints. No tire marks. No sign that the old green truck had ever existed. Nothing. It was as if the entire encounter had been erased, like the night itself had swallowed the evidence. The third rule was even stranger. Every night at 2:17 pump 4 will activate by itself. Don't touch it. By the time my third week arrived, I had stopped searching for logical explanations. Logic had already failed me. I had watched the lights go out. I had hidden beneath the register while things walked through the store. I had seen a man in a raincoat stand outside for almost an hour before walking into the woods with something that looked twice his size. I still couldn't explain what was happening, but I had learned one important thing. The rules worked. I no longer cared why Denise had them. I no longer needed to understand what was happening. I only cared about one thing: following them. Rule 3 came on a Tuesday morning. The night had been unusually quiet. I'd only served 3 customers since midnight. By 2:00 I was cleaning the coffee station for the second time just to keep myself awake. The clock behind the register caught my attention. 2:16. For some reason I stopped moving. I looked toward the front windows. Pump 4 sat beneath the canopy. Empty. No vehicle. No customer. No movement. Nothing. Then the digital clock changed. 2:17. A loud mechanical click echoed outside. My entire body froze. Pump 4 came alive. The screen lit up. The display flashed. The nozzle unlocked itself, but nobody was there. No car. No person. Nothing connected to it. Then I saw it. Gasoline began pouring out. Not from a vehicle. Not from a fuel tank. From the nozzle itself. The nozzle was still resting in its holder, yet gasoline flowed freely onto the concrete. My first instinct was to run outside. The emergency shut-off switch was mounted right beside the front door. One quick movement, one press, and I could stop every pump on the property. I even reached toward the handle. My fingers almost touched it. Then I remembered the rule. Don't touch it. I stopped, and I watched. The gasoline continued pouring. The smell reached the entrance almost immediately. The dark liquid spread beneath the pump, reflecting the bright canopy lights above. 10 seconds. 20. 30. The puddle grew larger. 40 seconds. A full minute. I stood there completely helpless, waiting for something to happen, because I knew there was a reason Denise had told me not to interfere. Finally, the pump clicked. The flow stopped. The display froze. I looked at the number. Exactly 10 gallons. Not 9. Not 11. Exactly 10. The nozzle locked itself back into place. The station became silent again. No footsteps. No voices. No movement. Nothing. I waited. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 5 minutes. Still, nothing happened. For a moment I almost believed it was over. Then I noticed something. The gasoline on the ground wasn't spreading anymore. It was moving. Slowly. Against the slope of the pavement. Flowing away from the drain. Away from the road. Toward the darkness beyond the pumps. Toward the tree line. And that was when I understood. Pump 4 hadn't been malfunctioning. It hadn't been leaking. It had been leaving something a message. And whatever was waiting out there had just received it. For several minutes I stood completely still, staring through the front window. The puddle beneath Pump 4 remained exactly where it was. 10 gallons of gasoline, sitting there beneath the bright canopy lights, waiting. I expected something to happen. A vehicle to appear. A person to step out of the darkness. Something to explain why Denise had warned me never to interfere. But nothing happened. The highway remained empty. The woods remained silent. No headlights appeared. No footsteps approached. No voices called out from the darkness. For a brief moment, a ridiculous thought crossed my mind. Maybe Denise was just wasting fuel every night for some strange reason. Maybe there was a hidden explanation. Maybe all of this had some normal answer that I simply hadn't found yet. Then I saw movement. Beyond the edge of the parking lot, at the tree line, something was walking toward the station. Slowly. At first I thought it was just a man. He wore dirty blue overalls and heavy work boots. The kind of clothes you would expect from someone who spent their life working outdoors. From a distance he looked completely ordinary, almost comforting. Then he stepped beneath the canopy lights, and every thought in my head disappeared, because what I thought was skin wasn't skin. It looked like tree bark. Dark brown cracks covered his face. They spread across his neck, his arms, and his hands like the surface of an ancient tree. There were patches of green moss growing along one side of his jaw. Small leaves pushed out from his left shoulder. The longer I looked at him, the more I realized I wasn't looking at a man wearing strange makeup. I was looking at something that had learned how to imitate one. He never looked toward the store. Never looked at me. He walked directly toward Pump 4, toward the gasoline. Then he slowly lowered himself, kneeling beside the puddle. For a few seconds he simply stared at it. Then he leaned forward and drank. A deep, slow gulp. Gasoline. Like it was water. Like it was something his body needed to survive. I felt my stomach twist. He stood back up. No reaction. No expression. No sign of pain. Then he turned around and walked straight back into the woods. The trees swallowed him, and within seconds, he was gone. I remained frozen behind the counter, trying to convince myself that what I had just witnessed was impossible. Then another figure appeared. This time, a woman. She walked out from between the trees wearing an old white dress. The fabric was torn and stained with mud from the knees down. Her black hair hung past her waist, dragging slightly behind her as she moved. But the strangest thing was how quietly she walked. No footsteps. No sound against the pavement. Nothing. She crossed the parking lot like she wasn't touching the ground at all. When she reached Pump 4, she didn't kneel. She didn't drink. She didn't touch the gasoline. She simply stared into the puddle. For almost a full minute, she stood there without moving, looking at her reflection, a reflection that should not have existed. The gasoline rippled slightly beneath her gaze. Then she smiled. A small, peaceful smile, like she had finally found something she had been searching for. She turned around and walked back into the darkness. The puddle remained untouched. 5 minutes later, another visitor arrived. This one was different, much different. I watched as it approached the canopy, and then it stopped. Because it was too tall, it had to lower its head to fit beneath the roof. My mind struggled to understand what I was seeing. It had the body of a man, broad shoulders, long arms, a human-like shape, but its head belonged to something else. A deer? Large, twisted antlers extended from its skull, bending in directions that looked completely unnatural. One eye glowed faintly yellow. The other was completely white, dead empty. In its hand, it carried an old metal lunchbox. The creature walked directly to Pump 4, no hesitation, no curiosity, like it had done this many times before. It opened the lunchbox, reached down with one enormous hand, scooped a small amount of gasoline inside, closed the lid, then walked away. It never looked toward the store, never acknowledged me, never even seemed aware that I was watching. It simply disappeared into the trees, and then they kept coming, one after another, never together, never in groups, always alone, like they were following some kind of rule. A woman with skin so pale it almost reflected the canopy lights. A man whose shadow moved half a second behind him. Something shaped like a human being but completely covered in thick gray fur despite the warm night air. An old man whose eyes were nothing but endless black. Each one emerged from the forest. Each one walked to Pump 4. Each one stopped beside the gasoline. And each one reacted differently. Some stared at it. Some touched it. Some drank from it. Some simply stood there as if paying respect. But none of them entered the store. None of them spoke. None of them looked through the window. They all followed the same pattern. Arrive, approach, take what they needed, leave. As if Pump 4 wasn't a gas pump at all. As if it was some kind of offering. A doorway. A promise. A payment. By 4:0 inches the morning, I had almost convinced myself the night couldn't become any stranger. Then the final visitor appeared. And somehow, that one scared me the most. Because it looked like a child. A little girl. She couldn't have been older than 7. She wore a yellow dress that looked faded with age. In her arms she carried a small teddy bear. One of its button eyes was missing. For the first time that night, I felt something besides fear. I felt sympathy. She walked slowly across the parking lot. Small steps. Quiet steps. Like a child wandering home after getting lost. She stopped beside Pump 4, looked down at the gasoline, then carefully lowered one finger into the puddle. Just one finger. She watched the liquid move around her hand. Then she smiled. Not a frightening smile. Not an evil one. A childlike smile, like she had just found something beautiful. She turned around, and happily skipped toward the woods. I watched her disappear into the darkness. Then halfway there, she stopped. Slowly, she turned around and looked directly at me. Through the glass, through the distance, through the darkness. Her eyes were completely black. No white, no reflection. Nothing human. My entire body went cold. Then she lifted one small hand and pointed. Not at me, not at the store. Behind the station, toward the forest. Without thinking, I followed where she was pointing, and that was when I saw them. Hundreds of figures, standing between the trees. Silent, motionless, watching. I had no idea when they arrived. I never heard footsteps, never saw movement. They had simply appeared, filling the darkness between the trunks. Tall figures, short figures, shapes I could not identify. All standing there, all facing the gas station, all watching me. The little girl lowered her arm, still staring through the window, and I finally understood something that made my blood run colder than anything I had seen that night. The visitors at Pump 4 were not the ones waiting. They were not the danger. They were only the ones allowed to come closer, because behind them, in the forest, there were hundreds more. And every single one of them had been watching me the entire time. The little girl stood there for one final moment, still staring at me, still holding that broken teddy bear. Then she slowly turned around and walked back toward the forest. The hundreds of figures between the trees moved with her. Not quickly, not suddenly. They simply faded, one by one, like shadows being swallowed by the darkness. Within seconds, the forest was empty again. No figures, no glowing eyes, no movement, nothing. Just trees, just silence, just the empty highway stretching into the night. I didn't leave the building until sunrise. I couldn't. Even when the sky began to brighten, even when birds started making noise in the distance, I remained behind that counter watching the tree line, waiting for something else to appear. Something that never came. When Denise arrived a little after 6, she walked inside carrying her usual coffee. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't ask why I looked like I hadn't slept. She simply glanced toward Pump 4. The gasoline was gone. Not dried. Not evaporated. Gone. The concrete beneath the pump was completely clean. No stain. No smell. No evidence that 10 gallons of fuel had ever been spilled there. It looked like nothing had happened, but I needed proof. After counting the register, I checked the pump records. The numbers were impossible. Pump 4 had dispensed exactly 10 gallons. Not 9, not 10.1, exactly 10. But there was no customer transaction, no payment, no missing money. The records balanced perfectly, like the station itself had given away the fuel and erased the evidence afterward. I never asked Denise about what I saw that night. I already knew what she would say. Don't ask. Some questions are dangerous because of the answers, but some questions are dangerous because the truth changes the way you see everything. After that night, I stopped needing explanations. Every night, at exactly 2:17 inches the morning, I watched Pump 4 activate by itself. I watched 10 gallons of gasoline spill onto the pavement, and every night, they came for it. The fourth rule was different. If the coffee machine starts brewing by itself after midnight, don't touch it. By the time I reached my third week working at the station, I no longer thought of Denise's rules as warnings. They were schedules. Events that happened with the same certainty as sunrise. The blackout happened when the lights went out. The man in the yellow raincoat arrived on clear nights. Pump 4 offered exactly 10 gallons every night at 2:17. Nothing happened early. Nothing happened late. The station followed its routine, and eventually I realized something that changed everything. The rules were not there to prevent these things from happening. They were there to make sure I didn't interfere. They weren't protecting me from them. They were protecting them from me, and Rule 4 proved it. It happened just after 1:00 inches the morning. The station had been empty for almost an hour. No customers, no cars, no voices from the highway. I had finished restocking the coolers, counted the register twice, and was halfway through sweeping the coffee area when I heard a sound behind me, a familiar click. I stopped. Slowly, I turned around. The coffee machine was on. The power light glowed. The heating element hummed. The machine was beginning its brewing cycle, but I hadn't touched it. There was no timer, no automatic setting, nothing programmed into it. Denise hated machines with timers. She always said they caused more trouble than they were worth. Every cup of coffee made in that station was started manually. Someone had to press the button. Someone had to be there. But nobody was. Water began dripping through the filter. Slowly, steadily, the empty pot began filling. Fresh coffee poured into the glass container. I stood there watching. Every instinct told me to unplug it, to stop it, to find out why it was happening. But then I remembered the rule. Don't touch it. So I placed the broom against the counter and waited. The smell spread through the store. Rich, dark, freshly brewed coffee. The exact smell Denise's coffee always had. The kind that made the whole station feel almost normal, almost safe. The machine finished. A final beep echoed through the empty building, and almost immediately, the bell above the front door rang. Someone walked inside. At first glance, he looked completely ordinary. Blue jeans, brown work jacket, an old baseball cap. The kind of person you would pass in a grocery store and forget 5 seconds later. He looked like a tired traveler stopping for coffee. Then he removed his hat, and my stomach dropped. There was no hair, no skin, no human face. His entire head was made of gray stone, smooth stone, cold stone. Tiny cracks spread across the surface like weathered concrete on an abandoned building. He didn't look at me. He didn't react to my fear. He simply walked to the coffee station, picked up a cup, poured himself coffee, placed $2 beside the register, and walked back outside. The bell rang as the door closed. I stood there completely frozen. Then, the bell rang again. Another customer entered. This one was much taller, much larger. He had to lower his body to fit through the doorway. His shoulders nearly scraped both sides of the entrance. He wore an old flannel shirt stretched tightly over a body that didn't look built from flesh. It looked carved, like someone had taken an enormous tree trunk and shaped it into a human figure. Branches extended from one shoulder. Small green leaves grew from them, and somehow inside the warm, still air of the store, those leaves moved, rustling softly. Even though there was no wind, the creature walked to the coffee station, carefully, almost politely. It picked up the smallest cup available. The cup looked ridiculous in its massive hand, like a toy. It poured coffee, almost to the top, added 3 packets of sugar, then stirred it gently with one finger, a finger larger than the cup itself. It placed the exact amount of change beside the register, then turned around and left. The bell rang. The door closed, and before I could process what I had just seen, the bell rang again, and again, and again. The customers kept coming, one after another, never rushing, never speaking, never looking at me, a woman whose eyes reflected the moonlight like a predator watching from the dark, an old man whose shadow moved a full second after his body did, something completely wrapped in thick gray bandages with only 2 bright yellow eyes visible beneath the layers, a figure wearing an expensive black suit, its face hidden beneath a constantly shifting cloud of dark smoke. They were all different. Some looked almost human, others looked like nightmares that had somehow learned how to walk, but they all followed the same pattern. Enter, walk to the coffee, pour a cup, pay, leave. No questions, no conversation, no explanation. Not one of them acknowledged me. It was the strangest part. After everything I had seen, after everything that had entered that store, what disturbed me most was how normal they acted. It reminded me of watching people stop at a roadside cafe before work. Workers grabbing breakfast, travelers getting coffee, people following a familiar morning routine. Except these weren't people. They were something else. And somehow, the gas station was the one place where they belonged. After about 15 minutes, something happened that I never thought I would see inside that gas station. It became crowded. Not just a few visitors, not 2 or 3 strange figures appearing from the darkness. A crowd, a line actually formed. A line at my gas station, and the strangest part was, they behaved like ordinary customers. Nobody pushed. Nobody complained. Nobody tried to cut ahead. They simply waited, quietly, patiently. The massive creature with branches growing from its shoulders stood calmly behind something barely 4 feet tall, its skin shimmering like wet fish scales beneath the fluorescent lights. Behind them waited a woman with enormous antlers curling from her head. Behind her stood a figure completely covered in dark feathers from its neck all the way down to its feet. Every few minutes the same thing happened. One customer finished. Another stepped forward. The line moved, and I found myself staring, not because they frightened me anymore. That was the part I couldn't understand. After everything I had witnessed, after everything that had walked through those doors, they weren't acting like monsters. They were acting like people, like regular customers. One creature accidentally spilled coffee on the counter and immediately grabbed a napkin to wipe it clean before leaving. Another noticed a crooked display of potato chip bags while waiting in line and quietly fixed it. Something with 6 long, delicate arms stood in front of the creamers for nearly a full minute, carefully comparing the labels. Hazelnut, French vanilla, caramel. It seemed genuinely unsure. Finally, after all that consideration, it chose plain black coffee. A huge creature covered in thick gray hide reached the door before several smaller customers. Instead of walking inside, first it stopped, held the door open, and waited. The smaller beings walked past. They looked up at it. They thanked it. And the creature simply nodded. The bell above the door rang again. This time an elderly woman shuffled inside. She was tiny, barely 4 feet tall. She carried an oversized handbag that looked almost too large for her body. Her nose curved slightly, almost like the beak of a bird. She moved slowly toward the coffee station, filled her cup, then opened her purse, and searched. For nearly 2 full minutes, she dug through the bag carefully, looking for exact change. Behind her stood the enormous tree-like creature, the same one with branches growing from its shoulders. Anyone else might have become impatient. Anyone else might have sighed or complained. But it didn't. It simply stood there, quiet, still, waiting for her, watching over her like an old friend. And that was when something inside me shifted. For a moment, the gas station didn't feel haunted. It didn't feel like a place where impossible things appeared from the forest. It felt like a small neighborhood coffee shop, a hidden place where a group of strange regulars came every night, a place I had somehow never known existed. Then the door opened again, and that feeling disappeared instantly. The next customer stepped inside, and the entire station changed. He was enormous, so tall that his back scraped against the ceiling tiles. His arms hung almost to the floor. His skin was pale, not like a human's pale, more like something that had never seen sunlight. The moment he entered, every other customer stopped moving. The line went silent, completely silent. The creature walked toward the coffee station. Slowly, carefully, it poured itself a cup. Then it noticed something. The coffee pot was almost empty. It stared at it for several seconds. Then, slowly, it turned toward me. My entire body locked up, because it was the first time all night that one of them had actually looked at me. Not through me. Not past me. At me. Every instinct screamed at me to step back. To run. To do something. But I didn't move. I stood there behind the counter, frozen. The creature looked from me to the coffee machine, then back to me. For a moment, I thought I had broken one of the rules. I thought I was about to find out what happened when one of them became angry. But instead, it did something completely unexpected. It gently placed the empty coffee pot beneath the machine, pressed the brew button. Once then, it nodded slightly to itself, almost like it was reminding me how the machine worked. A few seconds later, it turned around and walked out. No threat, no warning, no attack. Just another customer leaving after getting coffee. The line started moving again, and that was when I finally understood Rule 4. The coffee wasn't for me. The coffee machine wasn't part of my job. I wasn't the person serving them. I was just the caretaker. The station belonged to them for those few minutes, and while the machine was brewing, I was simply there to make sure nobody interrupted. Around 2:30 inches the morning, something happened that surprised me more than anything else. The front door opened. Deputy Brett Snyder walked inside. He looked exhausted, like he had been awake all night. He took 2 steps forward and stopped. His eyes moved across the station, across the customers, across the line stretching toward the coffee machine. Not one of them reacted. Nobody turned. Nobody stared. Nobody cared that a police officer had walked into the room. Brett slowly looked at me. I didn't say anything. I just shook my head once. That was enough. His eyes moved toward the coffee machine, then down toward the laminated rule sheet sitting beside the register. For a few seconds he stood there silently. Then he understood. He reached up, touched the brim of his hat, a quiet gesture of acknowledgement. Then he slowly backed toward the door. He never spoke, never asked questions, never tried to investigate. He simply left. Apparently, he knew better. The coffee pot finally ran empty sometime around 3:00. The last customer stepped forward, a small, unfamiliar figure. It poured the remaining coffee into a paper cup, then placed 3 silver coins beside the register. Not bills, not regular money, silver coins. It walked outside, the door closed, and almost instantly, the station emptied. The line disappeared faster than I thought possible. One by one, every customer vanished into the night. Within less than a minute, the parking lot was empty again. The highway was silent. The gas station returned to normal. I looked down at the 3 coins. They were old, ancient. Their surfaces were worn almost completely smooth. Whatever markings they once had were barely visible. Something about them felt wrong, like they didn't belong in this time. I reached my hand toward them. My fingers were inches away. Then, don't. The voice behind me made me jump. I turned around. Denise was standing in the doorway to the office. I hadn't heard her enter. I hadn't heard her move. She had simply appeared. She walked toward the counter, picked up the coins using a folded shop towel, and carefully placed them into a small steel lockbox hidden beneath the register. Then she looked at me. Her expression was serious. Never touched the old Roman coins. I stared at her. Roman. She closed the lockbox. Yes, I looked around the empty store, then back at her. I didn't even know you were here. Denise didn't answer immediately. She looked toward the coffee machine, then toward the dark windows facing the forest. Finally, she spoke quietly. That's because you weren't supposed to notice. And somehow, that frightened me more than anything that had walked through the door that night. I stay in the office on coffee nights. Denise's words caught me off guard. I stared at her. You watched all of that. She closed the steel lockbox beneath the counter and slowly put the key back into her pocket. I've watched it for 32 years. 32 years. The number stayed in my head. 3 decades of watching impossible things walk through those doors. 3 decades of pretending it was normal. I looked toward the empty coffee station. What are they? Denise didn't answer immediately. She looked around the store. The clean floors, the perfectly arranged shelves, the quiet aisles. Then she finally spoke. They're customers. I frowned. They're monsters. She shrugged slightly. They pay. I didn't know what to say. She pointed toward the coffee machine. They wait their turn. Then she looked back at me. You know what's funny? I stayed silent. I've had human customers cause far more trouble, and somehow, I couldn't argue with her. Denise took the empty coffee pot, rinsed it carefully in the sink, and placed it back beneath the machine. Within minutes, the station looked completely ordinary again. The impossible night disappeared beneath the routine of morning. If someone had walked in at that exact moment, they would have seen nothing unusual, just a small convenience store. Clean floors, full shelves, 2 employees preparing for the morning rush. No creatures, no strange visitors, no signs that anything impossible had happened. Except me. I knew, and I knew I would never look at that coffee machine the same way again. The 5th rule was the one I hated most. If a child comes in alone looking for his parents, don't help him look for them. By the time I reached that final rule, I had stopped wondering whether Denise was crazy. The rules worked. That was the only thing that mattered. I didn't understand them. I didn't know who created them. I didn't know what would happen if I broke one. But after everything I had seen, survival felt more important than answers. The 5th rule was tested near the end of my shift. The clock behind the register showed a little after 5. 0 inches the morning. Sunrise was still almost an hour away. The coffee machine had been cleaned. The floors had been mopped. The shelves were stocked. I was standing behind the counter, counting cigarette cartons while waiting for Denise to arrive and take over. The highway had been silent for nearly 30 minutes. No headlights. No engines. No travelers. Then, the front door chimed. I looked up. I expected another truck driver. Another exhausted traveler needing coffee. Instead, a child walked inside. A little boy. He couldn't have been older than 8. His jeans were covered in dirt. His sneakers looked like they had been dragged through mud for miles. In one hand, he held a faded, stuffed rabbit by the ear. The toy had probably once been white. Now it was gray and worn with dirty fur and a missing patch near one side. The boy closed the door quietly behind him. Then he stood there, looking around the station, confused, lost, like he had wandered into a place he didn't recognize. When he finally reached the counter, he looked up at me. His eyes were tired. Not scared, not angry, just exhausted. Have you seen my mom? For 1 second, just 1 second, I forgot the rules, because he looked like a normal child, a child who was alone, a child who needed help. My first instinct was to walk around the counter, to ask where he came from, to help him search, to do what any decent person would do. Then my fingers touched the laminated paper in my pocket. Rule 5. If a child comes in alone looking for his parents, don't help him look. My stomach tightened. I looked at the boy, then at the door, then back at the rule sheet in my mind. I'm sorry, I said quietly. I haven't seen them. The boy's expression changed, not dramatically, just a little. The sadness in his eyes became heavier. He hugged the stuffed rabbit closer. Okay, that was all he said. No anger, no crying, no questions. He simply stood there, and I hated myself for following the rule, because everything about him seemed harmless. No claws, no glowing eyes, no unnatural voice, just a tired little boy who had lost his parents. Finally, I grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler. You can have this. His face softened. A small smile appeared. Thank you. He accepted the bottle with both hands. Then he walked over to the freezer doors, sat down on the floor, and drank, quietly. Every few moments he reached over and gently patted the stuffed rabbit's head, like he was comforting it, like the toy was scared too. The station remained completely silent. No cars, no footsteps, no movement outside. I tried pretending to work. I rearranged shelves that didn't need rearranging. I wiped a counter that was already clean, but I kept watching him, because something about the situation felt wrong. Not obvious, not frightening, just wrong. Several minutes passed. Then the boy lifted his hand and brushed his hair away from his forehead, and that was when I saw them. Tiny black horns, barely visible, only a few inches long, smooth, curved slightly backward, small enough that I would have missed them if he hadn't moved. My entire body went cold. The boy didn't notice me staring. He simply continued drinking his water, waiting, like he knew exactly what was going to happen. A few minutes later, he stood up. He walked to the trash can, dropped the empty bottle inside, then turned toward me. I think they're here. My heart stopped. I hadn't heard a car. I hadn't heard footsteps. I hadn't heard anything. I immediately looked toward the front windows. The parking lot was empty. Completely empty. No headlights. No vehicles. No people. I looked back. The boy was already walking toward the door. He reached for the handle. Then he turned and gave me a small wave. Bye, the bell chimed. The door opened, and he stepped outside. I should have stayed behind the counter. I knew that. The rules existed for a reason. But curiosity had already gotten me into trouble before, and apparently, I still hadn't learned. I slowly moved toward the front window. careful not to let him see me. The boy crossed the empty parking lot. Then he stopped, and instead of heading toward the highway, he ran toward the grassy hill behind the station. He moved faster than any child should, like he wasn't tired anymore, like he was going home. He climbed the hill easily. When he reached the top, he stopped, and that was when I saw them, 2 figures waiting there. Even from hundreds of feet away, I knew they were enormous, 15 feet tall, maybe more. Their silhouettes stood against the brightening sky. Their shoulders were wider than the front doors of the station. Long curved horns rose from their heads, and their eyes glowed softly in the darkness. A deep red light, not angry, not threatening, almost like they were watching over something precious. The little boy walked toward them, and the 2 massive figures lowered themselves slightly, as if greeting him, as if they had been waiting all night. Then I realized something. The child had never been lost. He had never been looking for his parents. He had been waiting for me to make a choice, and somehow I had passed the test. The little boy finally reached the 2 figures waiting on the hill. The larger one moved first. Slowly, carefully, almost gently, it lowered itself toward the ground and reached out with enormous hands. The creature that had looked terrifying from a distance suddenly moved with a strange tenderness. It was his father, and he lifted the child into his arms as easily as if the boy weighed nothing at all. The little boy wrapped his arms around his neck. The stuffed rabbit disappeared against the creature's massive shoulder. Then, the second figure stepped closer. The mother, she placed one enormous hand on top of the boy's head, a hand large enough to cover his entire back. But the movement was gentle, protective, almost human. For several seconds, the 3 of them simply stood there, a family reunited beneath the fading darkness of the early morning. And somehow, that was the part that frightened me the most. Because for a brief moment it looked normal, almost painfully normal, like any parent picking up their child after school, like any family coming home after a long night. The father adjusted the boy comfortably against one shoulder. The child pointed back toward the gas station. I couldn't hear him from that distance, but I imagined what he was saying. Maybe he was telling them about the water bottle. Maybe he was telling them about the strange man behind the counter. Maybe he was telling them about me. Then all 3 of them slowly turned and looked directly toward the station, toward me. Even from hundreds of feet away, I felt it. The father's red eyes locked onto mine. He didn't blink, not once. The mother stood beside him, watching silently. Neither of them moved. Neither of them looked away. They simply stared, and in that moment I understood something. The rules weren't there because these creatures were always violent. They were there because even kindness could be dangerous. Even something that looked harmless could have consequences. I stood frozen behind the window, unable to move, unable to breathe. Then, suddenly, a hand touched my shoulder. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I turned around. Denise was standing behind me. She didn't look frightened. She didn't look surprised. She simply reached past me and pulled down the blinds. The white plastic slats dropped into place. The hill disappeared. The forest disappeared. The family disappeared. The station returned to normal. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Denise finally broke the silence. "That's why we don't help him." Her voice was quiet, almost tired. I looked at her. "Why?" She stared at the closed blinds. Then she said, "His parents are always hungry." Those words stayed with me. We never opened the blinds again. An hour passed, maybe more. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. It always did. After Denise unlocked the front door for the morning deliveries, I quietly stepped outside. The morning air felt colder than it should have. The sun was rising, but the warmth hadn't reached the ground yet. I walked toward the edge of the parking lot, and that was when I saw them. Footprints. The grass leading toward the hill was covered in them. The first set was small, the boy's footprints. Beside them were 2 others, much larger, much deeper. The impressions sank several inches into the earth. The ground beneath each step was crushed downward as if something impossibly heavy had walked across it. I stared at those tracks, trying to understand how something that large could move so quietly. The 3 trails continued toward the forest. The child's steps between the 2 enormous ones, like he had walked home safely between his parents. I followed the footprints with my eyes until they disappeared beneath the trees. And then, nothing. No movement. No voices. No sound from the woods. Just another quiet morning at the loneliest gas station on Highway 41. Eventually, morning arrived completely. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees. The shadows disappeared. And for the first time all night, the station looked ordinary again. Almost painfully ordinary. A delivery truck pulled into the parking lot. A woman stopped for coffee before work. A man filled his pickup truck, bought a lottery ticket, and continued down the highway. Normal people. Normal routines. Normal morning. If anyone had walked inside at that moment, they would have never guessed what had happened only an hour earlier. They would have seen a clean convenience store, fresh floors, full shelves, a quiet employee behind the counter, nothing more. Denise unlocked the doors, flipped the sign to open, then began counting the register like it was any other day. For a while, neither of us said anything. The silence between us felt different now. Not uncomfortable, just filled with everything I had seen. Finally, I broke it. "Can I ask you something?" Denise didn't look up. "You usually do." I looked through the front windows, past the pumps, past the highway, toward the endless forest behind the station. "Why is this place here?" Denise continued counting the bills in the drawer. 1, 2, 3. Slowly, carefully, as if she had heard that question many times before. When she finally answered, her voice was calm. "Because every road has travelers." I waited. I thought she was going to continue. I thought after everything I had seen, after everything I had survived, maybe she would finally tell me the truth. But Denise only closed the register drawer. Then she looked toward the highway. Some travelers are just easier to recognize than others. I stayed silent, because I knew there was another question sitting between us. One I wasn't sure I wanted to ask. How long had this station been here? And how many things had stopped by before I ever arrived? Instead of answering, Denise simply turned around and started making another pot of coffee. That was her response. Not an explanation. Not a warning. Just coffee. I watched her prepare it with the same calm routine she used every morning. Measure the grounds. Fill the machine. Press the button. Like we weren't standing in a gas station that served creatures no human should ever have seen. After another minute, I tried again. "Yeah, but where did they come from?" This time, she stopped. Only for a moment, but I noticed. Her hand remained still above the counter. The coffee machine continued humming behind her. Then she slowly looked at me and shrugged. Oh, a pause. I stopped asking that a long time ago. That answer bothered me more than if she had told me something terrifying, because there was no fear in her voice, no curiosity, no confusion, just acceptance. The kind of acceptance someone develops after living with something impossible for far too long, like she had spent years asking the same questions, and eventually realized some answers were never meant to be found. Some doors were better left closed, some truths were better left untouched. Before I could say anything else, the front door opened. A family walked in to pay for their gas, and just like that, the conversation was over. Denise smiled politely, wished them a safe trip, then returned to stocking cigarettes behind the counter. Just another morning, just another routine, as if we hadn't been discussing things that had crawled out of the darkness for decades, as if we had been talking about the weather. I grabbed my coffee and stepped outside. The morning air was cold. A thin layer of fog drifted across Highway 41, slowly moving between the trees. Somewhere beyond the forest, birds were singing. The world looked peaceful. Normal. Almost too normal. The parking lot looked exactly the same as it had on my first day. The same pumps, the same faded signs, the same empty stretch of highway. And then, something caught my attention. I looked across the road, really looked. For the first time since I started working there, I actually paid attention to what was on the other side, and my stomach tightened. There was no road. There should have been. There had to be. Every night I had watched headlights appear from that direction. Vehicles came through the trees. Customers arrived from that side. I had seen it hundreds of times, but in daylight, there was nothing. No road, no driveway, no gravel path, no hidden entrance, only forest. Dense hardwood trees stretching endlessly into the distance, untouched, silent, impossible. I stood there staring, trying to find the thing I had obviously missed. A turn, a side road, anything, but there was nothing, just trees. For a moment I wondered if I had somehow imagined every vehicle I had seen arrive from that direction. Then another customer pulled into the station, an older man in a pickup truck. He filled his tank, walked inside, bought coffee, paid cash, wished me a good morning, then drove away. A few minutes later, another car arrived, then another. The morning continued. People came and went. The station returned to its normal rhythm, and slowly, the impossible started feeling ordinary. That was the part that scared me the most, because I finally understood something. Before I started working there, I believed monsters belonged to stories, to movies, to nightmares. I believed they lived somewhere far away, somewhere humans could never reach. I was wrong. They weren't hiding in forgotten caves. They weren't waiting in abandoned places. They were here. They drank coffee. They stood in line. They paid for what they took. They worried about their children. They picked them up when they were done. And every night, on a lonely highway surrounded by endless woods, they stopped at my gas station for fuel.